Echoes in the subway. The dim glow of fluorescent lights flickered above as Amara adjusted the strap of her worn guitar case and smoothed her thick, coiled hair under a fraying knit cap. The subway platform buzzed with its usual chaos: clattering heels, muffled announcements, and the distant thunder of approaching trains. It was a cacophony of city life, and for Amara, it was her stage. Amara had claimed this corner of the station as her own months ago. The acoustics here were different, better. Her voice carried farther, resonating through the cavernous space, filling every crevice with her soulful melodies. This spot, nestled near a cluster of vending machines, offered a semblance of safety from the bustling crowds and the sharp eyes of transit officers who often reminded her that busking without a permit wasn't allowed. She wasn't oblivious to the risk, but Amara had no other choice. Her mother's condition was worsening. Lupus wasn't a battle they could fight with hope alone. It demanded money for medications, doctor visits, and a constant flow of food her family could barely afford. Amara's younger siblings relied on her for more than just lullabies at night. She was their rock, their provider, and sometimes their shield against the harsher realities of life. Amara inhaled deeply, the metallic tang of the subway air filling her lungs. Her hands were trembling as she pulled her guitar from its case. The strings were worn, and the body bore the scars of years of use: a crack near the neck, faded varnish. Still, it was her most prized possession. Her father had given it to her years ago, promising that her voice combined with this instrument would change the world someday. Now, it served a much smaller purpose: keeping her family afloat. She tightened the capo and plucked a few tentative notes, adjusting the tuning by ear. The hum of the subway filled her ears, but her mind drifted to her mother's voice that morning. "Don't overwork yourself, Amara. I'll manage," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible over the wheezing of her labored breaths. "I'm fine, Ma," Amara had lied, swallowing her own exhaustion as she packed her meager lunch of a bruised apple and a stale roll. "We need this." Now, as she stood on the precipice of yet another performance, those words clung to her. Amara forced a smile, her fingers settling into the familiar rhythm of the opening chords of her first song. It was a cover of a classic soul tune, something most subway commuters recognized, a melody that could momentarily pull them out of their hurried routines. The first notes floated into the air, hesitant yet warm. She began to sing, her voice low and throaty at first, before climbing into its full range. The lyrics spoke of resilience and love, of fighting through the darkest days. It wasn't just a song, it was her prayer. Across the platform, a woman in a tailored black coat paused mid-step. Her name was Vanessa Ainsworth, a world-renowned jazz singer on her way to the airport after a whirlwind tour. Her face, adorned with the flawless makeup that had graced countless album covers, was usually a mask of poise and detachment. But now, it was unreadable as she stood frozen, her gaze locked on the girl singing across the tracks. Vanessa wasn't one to linger in subway stations. Her world was one of limousines, penthouses, and sold-out arenas. Yet, something about the voice that carried over the tracks stopped her in her tracks. It was raw, haunting, and filled with a kind of pain she hadn't felt in years. Vanessa had once been that girl, a young black woman singing in places that didn't feel like they belonged to her, clawing her way toward a dream everyone told her was too big. She tightened her grip on the strap of her designer handbag, her heart thudding as she watched the girl pour herself into the song. Amara's eyes remained shut as she lost herself in the music. She didn't see Vanessa watching, didn't see the crowd thinning as a train pulled into the station. Her focus was on the few coins that clinked into her guitar case. It wasn't much, a couple of quarters, a crumpled dollar bill, but she kept singing. If she stopped, even for a moment, the emotions threatening to overwhelm her might break through. When she opened her eyes, she caught sight of Vanessa just as the train doors closed. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, a connection charged with something Amara couldn't name. Then, the train was gone, taking the woman with it. Amara blinked, her song faltering for the first time all morning. Who was that? She looked familiar, like someone she'd seen before on TV or a magazine cover. But there was no time to linger on the thought. Another train would arrive soon, and with it, a new wave of potential listeners. Vanessa leaned back in her seat on the train, her mind racing. That voice, that girl. There was something about her that Vanessa couldn't shake. It wasn't just the voice, it was the look in her eyes. She had seen it before, years ago, in the mirror. Determination tempered by desperation. She pulled out her phone and searched for the station schedule. She was supposed to head to the airport, but something compelled her to stay, to turn back. For the first time in years, Vanessa canceled her plans. She had to know more about the girl in the subway. As the hours wore on, Amara continued to sing, her voice growing hoarser with each song. She glanced at her watch and sighed. It was almost time to head home. The haul for the day was pitiful, barely enough to cover dinner, let alone her mother's medication. She packed up her guitar, the case feeling heavier than usual, and began walking toward the exit. She didn't notice the figure descending the station stairs until she heard her name. Amara. The voice was rich, commanding, and familiar. Amara turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the woman from earlier. Vanessa Ainsworth stood before her, her polished exterior somehow softened by a look of genuine curiosity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You know my name," Amara stammered, clutching the strap of her guitar case as if it could anchor her in place. Vanessa smiled, tilting her head slightly. "I asked around. People here know you. You're hard to forget." Amara blinked, her mind racing. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "You might not," Vanessa admitted, "but I know talent when I see it, and you have it." The words hit Amara like a tidal wave. She stared at Vanessa, struggling to process what was happening. Could this be real? Could this moment, this chance, be what she had been waiting for? Vanessa extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Come with me. Let's talk." Amara hesitated, the weight of her responsibilities pulling at her, but something in Vanessa's eyes, a flicker of understanding, made her reach out and take the offered hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope loomed in Amara's chest. The unexpected offer. Amara's heart raced as she followed Vanessa out of the subway station. The bustling city air hit her like a wave, filled with the sounds of honking cars, street vendors calling out their wares, and the faint strains of music from a distant saxophone player. Her mind was spinning with questions, each one vying for her attention, but her mouth stayed shut. She couldn't afford to ruin whatever this was before it began. Vanessa walked with a quiet confidence, her long coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Amara couldn't help but feel small next to her, not just in stature but in presence. This woman, whoever she truly was, radiated the kind of energy Amara had only ever seen in performers at the top of their game. Vanessa's polished demeanor made Amara acutely aware of her own scuffed sneakers, frayed jacket, and the cheap guitar case she clutched like a lifeline. They turned a corner into a quieter street, the noise of the subway and city fading into the background. Vanessa stopped in front of a small cafe with floor-to-ceiling windows, its warm interior glowing invitingly against the cold, gray day. "Let's talk here," Vanessa said, her voice smooth but firm. She held the door open for Amara, who hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, and for the first time all day, Amara felt a tiny pang of comfort. Vanessa led her to a corner table away from the other patrons, pulling out a chair with a practiced grace. Amara sat down across from her, her fingers fiddling nervously with the zipper on her guitar case. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, in this moment, with someone so clearly out of her league. Vanessa ordered 2 coffees without asking, then leaned back in her chair, studying Amara like an artist observing a canvas. Amara shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, her cheeks flushing. "You're talented," Vanessa began, her tone measured. "More talented than most people I've heard in years." Amara blinked, caught off guard by the directness. Thank you," she stammered. But I don't think. Don't sell yourself short, Vanessa interrupted, leaning forward slightly. I've been in this industry long enough to recognize raw potential when I see it. You've got it. But you're wasting it in that subway station. Amara's stomach twisted at the words. Wasting it. The accusation stung, even though she knew it wasn't meant to hurt. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain that singing in the subway wasn't a choice, it was survival. But Vanessa held up a hand, silencing her. Let me guess, Vanessa said, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're singing down there because you don't have the luxury of time. You're juggling responsibilities, family, maybe, and you think that if you just keep pushing, keep grinding, something will eventually break your way. Amara stared at her, stunned. How did she know? How could this woman, a stranger, see right through her like that? Vanessa sighed, a faint trace of something resembling regret crossing her face. I know that look in your eyes because I've been there. A long time ago. The coffees arrived, and Vanessa paused to stir a packet of sugar into hers. Amara wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her chilled fingers. She didn't speak, afraid that if she did, she might cry. I grew up in a neighborhood a lot like this one, Vanessa continued, her voice softer now. Singing was the only thing that ever made sense to me. But nobody hands you a golden ticket. You have to fight for it, and sometimes, even fighting isn't enough. Amara swallowed hard, her throat tightening. So, what changed for you? Vanessa smiled, a little sadly. A chance meeting. Much like this one. Someone saw me, believed in me, and opened a door I didn't even know existed. I'm here because of that one moment. Amara's heart thudded painfully against her ribcage. Was this her moment? Could this be the break she had been dreaming of, praying for? I want to do the same for you, Vanessa said, leaning forward again. I want to help you find your voice, not just the one people hear, but the one that tells your story, the one that makes them stop and listen. Amara's eyes widened. Why? I mean, you don't even know me. Vanessa chuckled, a low, warm sound. Because I see myself in you, and because someone did it for me when I needed it most. Amara shook her head, her hands tightening around the coffee cup. I don't know if I can. My family, my mom's sick. I can't just walk away from everything and chase a dream. Vanessa's expression softened. I'm not asking you to walk away from anything. I'm asking you to let me help. Let me connect you with the right people, give you a platform to share your talent with the world. Amara hesitated, the weight of her responsibilities crashing down on her all at once. She thought of her mother, frail and tired, waiting at home. She thought of her little brothers who looked to her for everything. Could she risk stepping away, even for a moment, when so many people depended on her? Look, Vanessa said gently, sensing Amara's hesitation. I'm not offering you a handout. This will be hard work, harder than anything you've done before. But I promise you, if you're willing to try, it'll be worth it. Amara stared into her coffee, the steam swirling up into the air like a ghost of her doubts. Could she trust this woman? Could she trust herself to succeed if she did? Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Vanessa's. What exactly are you offering? Vanessa smiled, the corners of her lips curling upward in satisfaction. For starters, I'll bring you into my world. Studio time, vocal training, a chance to perform at a few small gigs to get your name out there. Nothing crazy, just enough to test the waters and see if this is really what you want. Amara's heart skipped a beat. Studio time, vocal training, gigs. The words sounded like a dream she hadn't dared to dream. But Vanessa added, her tone serious now, if you take this step, you have to commit. Half measures won't cut it. You'll need to show me you're willing to put in the work. Amara nodded slowly, her mind racing. Could she balance this with everything else in her life? Could she find a way to make it work? I need to think about it, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa didn't seem surprised. Of course. Take the night, but don't let fear hold you back. Sometimes, the hardest decisions lead to the best outcomes. She slid a sleek black business card across the table, her name embossed in gold letters beneath a phone number. "Call me when you're ready." Amara picked up the card, her fingers tracing the raised lettering. Vanessa stood, adjusting her coat and giving Amara a small, encouraging smile before walking toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly as she left. Amara sat there for a long time, staring at the card, her thoughts a chaotic tangle of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Could she really take this leap? Could she afford not to? A torn heart. The walk home felt longer than usual, every step echoing with the weight of Amara's thoughts. Vanessa's business card was still clutched tightly in her hand, the edges creased from her nervous grip. She kept glancing down at the elegant gold lettering, as if it might vanish if she looked away too long. Her mind buzzed with questions, doubts, and a flicker of hope she was almost too scared to acknowledge. The streets were quieter now, the sun dipping behind the crumbling facades of the old apartment buildings. A few children kicked a deflated soccer ball on the cracked pavement, their laughter ringing out like a melody that didn't belong to this place. Amara stopped for a moment to watch them, her heart aching. She had been like them once. Innocent, unburdened, dreaming of things bigger than the world she knew. But life had a way of stripping that innocence away. By the time she reached her building, the light was fading, and the familiar creak of the rusted front door greeted her. The hallway smelled of damp concrete and the faint, clinging scent of fried onions from a neighbor's dinner. Amara climbed the stairs slowly, the sounds of her mother's coughing filtering down before she even reached their door. Inside, the small apartment was dimly lit, the single bulb in the living room casting long shadows over the peeling wallpaper. Her mother was lying on the couch, her frail frame swaddled in blankets that looked too heavy for her to bear. She opened her eyes as Amara walked in, managing a weak smile. "You're late," her mother said, her voice rasping. "I stopped to rest," Amara lied, setting her guitar case gently on the floor. She slipped Vanessa's card into her jacket pocket, not ready to bring it up yet. "How are you feeling?" Her mother shrugged, her thin shoulders barely moving under the blankets. "I'm fine. Just tired." Amara knelt beside her, brushing a strand of graying hair from her mother's damp forehead. She could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a low-grade fever that had lingered for days. The sight of her mother like this made Amara's chest tighten with guilt. She should have earned more today. She should have done better. "I'll get dinner started," Amara said, rising quickly to avoid the lump forming in her throat. In the kitchen, she scraped together a meal from the little they had left: rice, canned beans, and the last bit of frozen vegetables from the back of the freezer. The rhythmic sound of the spoon scraping the pot was almost soothing, a familiar monotony that helped drown out the chaos in her mind. She thought of Vanessa's words, her offer, and the weight of what it could mean. Amara couldn't ignore the possibilities. Studio time, vocal training, gigs, things she had dreamed about but never thought she could actually have. But could she balance that with everything her family needed from her? What if she failed? What if she succeeded but left them behind in the process? "Amara," her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, weak but insistent. She turned to see her mother struggling to sit up, her face pale but determined. Amara hurried over, helping her adjust the pillows behind her back. "What's on your mind?" her mother asked, her eyes sharper than Amara expected. "You've been quiet since you walked in." Amara hesitated, biting her lip. She had never been good at hiding things from her mother, but this felt too big, too uncertain to explain. Still, the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "I met someone today," she began, her voice faltering. "A woman. She said she wants to help me with my singing." Her mother's brows furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Help you how?" "She said she could get me into a studio, train me, help me perform," Amara said, her words rushing now. She's someone important. I think she's a famous singer, or she was." Her mother's expression softened slightly, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. And what does she want in return? Nothing, Amara said quickly. At least, not yet. She just wants me to try, to see if I can make something of myself. Her mother reached out, taking Amara's hand in her own. Her grip was weak but steady. Amara, you have a gift. I've always known that. But you also have a family that needs you. Your brothers, me. We can't do this without you. The words felt like a knife twisting in Amara's chest. She knew her mother didn't mean to guilt her, but the truth was undeniable. They depended on her for everything. From the few dollars she brought home each day to the meals she managed to scrape together. I know, Ma, Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. But what if this is my chance? What if this is how I can really help us? I could make enough money to get you the care you need, to get the boys into a better school. Or you could lose everything, her mother interrupted, her tone firm. You could spend all your time chasing something that doesn't work out. And then where will we be? Amara pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. The words stung because they echoed her own fears. You think I haven't thought about that? She said, her voice rising. I think about it every second of every day. But I can't keep doing this, Ma. I can't keep singing in the subway and hoping someone throws $1 in my case. It's not enough. It's never enough. Her mother's face fell, and Amara immediately regretted her outburst. She turned away, pacing the small kitchen as tears burned at the corners of her eyes. The weight of everything, the responsibility, the fear, the hope, it was all too much. After a long moment, her mother spoke again, her voice softer this time. Amara, I don't want to hold you back. If this is what you want, what you really want, then I won't stop you. But you need to think carefully. Dreams are powerful, but they can also be dangerous. Amara nodded, unable to speak. She finished preparing the meal in silence, her mother's words echoing in her mind. That night, after her brothers were asleep and her mother's breathing had settled into a shallow rhythm, Amara sat on the edge of her mattress, staring at the business card in her hand. The gold letters glinted faintly in the dim light, a reminder of the possibility Vanessa had offered her. She thought of her father, his voice warm and steady as he taught her first chords on the guitar. Your voice can take you anywhere, Amara, he had said, but you have to be brave enough to follow it. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she clutched the card to her chest. She didn't know if she was brave enough, but she also didn't know if she could forgive herself if she didn't try. Amara reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Vanessa Ainsworth, the voice said, smooth and confident. Amara swallowed hard. It's me, she said, her voice shaking. Amara. Vanessa didn't hesitate. I hoped you'd call. I want to try, Amara said, her words coming out in a rush. I don't know if I can do it, but I want to try. Vanessa's voice softened, filled with something Amara couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe, or relief. You've already taken the hardest step, Amara. The rest, we'll figure it out together. As Amara hung up, a mixture of fear and excitement coursed through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. The first step. The morning sun crept through the thin curtains of Amara's room, casting muted rays over the cluttered space. Her guitar case leaned against the wall, and piles of sheet music were scattered across the floor. Today felt different. The air carried a strange mix of anticipation and dread. She stared at her phone, the call to Vanessa replaying in her mind. The woman had promised to pick her up at noon, and now, as the clock struck 10, Amara found herself pacing. Her brothers were already awake, playing a makeshift game of tag in the cramped living room. Their laughter echoed against the peeling wallpaper, bringing a faint smile to her face. She peeked into the kitchen to find her mother seated at the small table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Her frailty was more pronounced in the morning light, the hollowing of her cheeks and the tremor in her hands a stark reminder of why Amara needed this to work. "You're nervous," her mother said, not looking up from her cup. Amara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Maybe a little." Her mother's eyes lifted to meet hers, soft but searching. "You should be. It means you care." Amara exhaled, pushing off the doorframe and moving to sit across from her mother. The table was scratched and worn, like much of the furniture in their apartment, but it had borne witness to countless family meals, late-night conversations, and quiet moments like this. She traced a groove in the wood with her finger, struggling to find the right words. "I'm scared, Ma," she admitted finally. "What if I mess this up? What if it's a mistake?" Her mother reached out, covering Amara's hand with her own. "You won't know unless you try. But listen to me, Amara. Whatever happens, don't lose yourself. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are and why you started singing in the first place." Amara nodded, her throat tight. She squeezed her mother's hand before standing. "I'll do my best." By the time noon rolled around, Amara had barely touched the lunch she prepared for herself. Her brothers were napping, and her mother was resting on the couch. Amara stood by the window, watching the street below, her guitar case slung over her shoulder. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and Vanessa stepped out, her tailored coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Amara's stomach twisted. This was it. The car ride was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Vanessa glanced over at Amara, who sat stiffly, her hands clutching her guitar case like a lifeline. "Nervous?" Vanessa asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "A little," Amara admitted, her voice barely audible. Vanessa's smile widened. "Good. Nerves mean you care. They keep you sharp, but don't let them control you. Use them." Amara nodded, trying to take the words to heart. The city blurred past the window, a mosaic of skyscrapers, graffiti-covered walls, and bustling streets. Eventually, the car pulled into a quieter neighborhood, and they stopped in front of a building with tall glass windows and a minimalist logo etched into the door. Haven Studios. Vanessa led Amara inside, her heels clicking against the polished floors. The space was sleek and modern, with soundproof rooms lining the hallway and a reception desk manned by a cheerful young woman who greeted Vanessa warmly. "This way," Vanessa said, gesturing for Amara to follow her down the corridor. They entered a spacious recording studio, the walls lined with acoustic panels and shelves filled with recording equipment. A grand piano stood in one corner, and a microphone was set up in the center of the room, its metallic surface gleaming under the soft lighting. Amara's breath hitched. She had seen rooms like this in movies and music videos, but had never imagined she'd set foot in one. The air felt heavy with possibility, and her hands trembled as she set down her guitar case. "This is where we'll start," Vanessa said, leaning against the console. "I want to hear you sing. No distractions, no subway noise, just your voice." Amara swallowed hard. Her palms were sweaty, and her throat felt dry. She fumbled with her guitar case, pulling out the worn instrument and adjusting the strings. Vanessa watched her with a patient, almost maternal gaze. When Amara finally stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. This wasn't like singing in the subway. Here, there were no crowds to fade into, no trains to drown out the cracks in her voice. Every note would be heard, every flaw exposed. She closed her eyes, gripping the neck of her guitar tightly as she began to play. The melody was slow and deliberate, a song she had written late one night after a particularly hard day. The lyrics spoke of longing, of fighting against the tide, of finding light in the darkest places. Her voice wavered at first, but as the chords filled the room, she found her rhythm. Vanessa didn't interrupt. She didn't offer feedback or criticism. She simply listened, her expression unreadable as Amara poured herself into the song. By the time the last note faded, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the recording equipment. Amara opened her eyes, her chest heaving. She couldn't bring herself to look at Vanessa, afraid of what she might see on the woman's face. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "You have something special, Amara," she said, her voice soft but certain. That was raw and honest. "But it needs work. You've got power in your voice, but you're not using it fully. And your phrasing, it could be sharper. There's room to grow." Amara nodded, her cheeks flushing with a mix of relief and embarrassment. She had expected as much, but hearing it still stung. Vanessa smiled, stepping closer. "And that's a good thing. Growth is what we're here for. If you're willing to put in the effort, I promise you, we'll make something beautiful." Over the next few hours, Vanessa guided Amara through vocal exercises and gave her tips on technique. She pushed Amara to experiment with different styles, encouraging her to step outside her comfort zone. It was exhausting but exhilarating, and by the end of the session, Amara felt like she had learned more in a few hours than she had in years of singing on her own. As they left the studio, the late afternoon sun bathed the streets in a warm golden light. Vanessa turned to Amara, her expression serious. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The road ahead won't be easy, but if you're willing to trust me, I'll do everything I can to help you succeed." Amara nodded, her heart pounding. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving towards something bigger than herself. And that was enough. For now, a world she never knew. The following days were a whirlwind for Amara. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, prepare breakfast for her family, and make sure her brothers were ready for school. Then she'd head to the studio, her guitar case slung over her shoulder and her nerves buzzing like static electricity. Vanessa had made it clear that this wasn't going to be a casual arrangement. If Amara wanted to succeed, she had to commit fully. Her mother's words echoed in her mind with every step she took. "Don't lose yourself." At first, the studio was an intimidating place. Everyone seemed to move with purpose, their steps confident and their expressions focused. Amara often felt like an imposter, like she didn't belong in this gleaming professional world. But Vanessa never let her sink too far into those thoughts. "You're here because you deserve to be," Vanessa had said one day, her tone firm. "Don't let anyone, not even yourself, convince you otherwise." The lessons were grueling. Vanessa pushed Amara harder than she thought possible, breaking down her technique, challenging her to try new styles, and forcing her to confront her fears head-on. They worked on everything from vocal control to stage presence, often spending hours perfecting a single phrase or gesture. Amara's throat ached after each session, her fingers raw from playing her guitar, but she refused to give up. Vanessa wasn't just a mentor, she was a force of nature. She had an uncanny ability to zero in on Amara's insecurities, to coax out her confidence and silence her self-doubt. But she could also be brutally honest, pointing out every flaw with a precision that sometimes left Amara reeling. "You're holding back," Vanessa said one afternoon, after Amara had stumbled through a particularly emotional ballad. "Why?" Amara looked down at her hands, her knuckles white from gripping her guitar too tightly. "I don't know," she mumbled. Vanessa crossed her arms, her expression stern. "Yes, you do. You're afraid." "Of what?" Amara hesitated, her throat tightening. "Of failing," she admitted finally. "Of putting everything I have into this, and it's still not being enough." Vanessa's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Failure isn't the worst thing, Amara. Not trying. That's what will haunt you. You have a story to tell, and people need to hear it. But they'll only listen if you're willing to let them see you. The real you." The words stayed with Amara long after the session ended. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, she thought about everything she had been through. The nights spent singing in the subway, the laughter of strangers, the crushing weight of her family's needs. It had all shaped her, molded her into the person she was. But had she been holding back? Was she afraid to be truly seen? 2 weeks into her training, Vanessa introduced Amara to a new challenge, her first live performance. It was a small venue, a local jazz club with dim lighting, red velvet curtains, and an intimate stage. The kind of place where audiences came not just to be entertained, but to feel something. "This is your test," Vanessa said as they stood backstage, the muffled hum of the audience filtering through the walls. "It's not about perfection. It's about connection. Can you make them feel what you feel?" Amara nodded, her hands trembling. She clutched her guitar, the familiar weight a small comfort. Her stomach churned with nerves, but she reminded herself of Vanessa's words. Use them. When her name was called, Amara stepped onto the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs. The spotlight was blinding, the audience a shadowy mass beyond its reach. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone as she settled onto the stool at the center of the stage. Her fingers found the strings of her guitar, and the first notes of her song filled the room. It was a piece she had written herself, a raw, aching melody about love and loss, about holding on when everything felt like it was slipping away. Her voice started soft, almost trembling, but as the song progressed, it grew stronger, filling every corner of the room. For the first time, Amara let herself go. She didn't think about her technique or her insecurities. She didn't worry about the audience or whether they would like her. She just sang. Her heart lay bare in every word, every note. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that felt heavy with meaning. Then the applause began, slow at first, but building until it was a roar. Amara blinked, her breath catching in her throat. People were standing, clapping, cheering. For her. Backstage, Vanessa was waiting, her arms crossed and a rare smile on her face. Now that, she said, was a performance. Amara grinned, her cheeks aching from the force of it. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just on the stage, but in her own skin. But not everything came so easily. The success of that night was followed by days of doubt and exhaustion. Balancing her training with her responsibilities at home was a constant struggle. Her mother's health continued to decline, and the medical bills loomed larger with each passing week. Some nights, Amara lay awake, questioning whether she was doing the right thing. Her brothers didn't make it any easier. At 12 and 10, they were old enough to understand that things were hard but too young to fully grasp the sacrifices Amara was making. They missed her being home more often, and their frustration sometimes spilled over into arguments. "You're always gone," her youngest brother, Jamal, had said one evening, his voice thick with tears. "What if Ma needs you?" Amara had knelt down, taking his small hands in hers. "I'm doing this for all of us," she said. "I promise, one day it'll all be worth it." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. Was she being selfish? Was she chasing a dream at the expense of her family? Vanessa noticed the change in Amara's energy during their sessions. One day, she called Amara into her office, a sleek, glass-walled space that felt both intimidating and inviting. "What's going on?" Vanessa asked, her tone more gentle than usual. "You're not fully here." Amara hesitated, then spilled everything. The guilt, the fear, the weight of her family's needs. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. "Amara," she said finally, "there's no perfect way to do this. Sacrifice is part of the journey. And yes, it's hard, harder than most people will ever understand. But you're not alone. Lean on the people who believe in you. Let them help." The words sank deep into Amara's heart. That night, she sat with her mother, explaining everything, her fears, her hopes, and the toll it was taking on her. To her surprise, her mother didn't scold her or tell her to stop. "You're stronger than I ever was," her mother said, her voice soft but firm. "Keep going. Make this count." From then on, Amara threw herself into her training with renewed determination. She let herself lean on Vanessa and the small circle of people who had started to rally around her. Slowly but surely, she began to see a path forward, not just for herself, but for her family. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Amara felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was growing, evolving, and building something that could one day change everything. And she wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. A stage of her own. The night of Amara's biggest performance arrived faster than she had anticipated. The past months had been a whirlwind of rehearsals, vocal lessons, and countless small gigs. Vanessa had been true to her word, introducing Amara to influential producers, experienced vocal coaches, and musicians who challenged her to stretch beyond her limits. Each step had been a test, but now she stood at the edge of something greater, a stage she could truly call her own. The venue was nothing like the dim subway platforms where her journey had begun. It was a small but prestigious concert hall, known for showcasing rising stars. The polished floors gleamed under the soft, golden glow of the chandeliers, and rows of velvet-covered seats stretched toward the stage. Amara had been told the place was sold out, a fact that sent a thrill of excitement and a jolt of fear coursing through her. Backstage, the buzz of activity was palpable. Technicians adjusted lighting rigs, sound engineers checked the equipment, and assistants hurried about with clipboards and headsets. Amidst the chaos, Amara stood in front of a mirror, her reflection staring back at her. She hardly recognized herself. Gone were the scuffed sneakers and fraying jacket. Tonight, she wore a fitted jumpsuit in a deep shade of emerald that complemented her dark skin, her curls framing her face like a halo. Her makeup was subtle but striking, her lips painted a bold crimson. Yet, beneath the glamour, she still felt like the same girl who had sung for spare change in the subway, her heart beating out a rhythm of hope and desperation. Vanessa appeared behind her in the mirror, her presence calm and steady. "How are you feeling?" she asked, resting a hand on Amara's shoulder. Amara took a shaky breath. Terrified. Vanessa chuckled softly. "Good. That means you're ready." Amara turned to face her mentor, searching her eyes for reassurance. "What if I mess up? What if they don't like me?" Vanessa's expression softened. "You're not here to be liked, Amara. You're here to be heard. Remember why you started singing. Let them feel your story. If you do that, you won't fail." The words settled over Amara like a blanket, soothing her nerves. She nodded, her grip on the microphone tightening as her name was announced. The applause that followed was thunderous, vibrating through the walls. "It's time," Vanessa said, her smile filled with quiet pride. "Go show them who you are." The stage lights were blinding, but Amara welcomed them. She walked to the center, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and adjusted the microphone. The audience was a blur beyond the spotlight, but she could feel their energy, a mix of anticipation and curiosity. This was her moment. She strummed the first chord on her guitar, the notes resonating through the hall. The room hushed instantly, the audience leaning forward in their seats. Amara closed her eyes, letting the music guide her as she began to sing. The song was her own, a piece she had written late one night after her mother's health had taken a turn for the worse. It was raw and unpolished, a reflection of her fears and her dreams. The lyrics spoke of struggle, of standing at the edge of defeat but refusing to fall. As the words spilled from her lips, Amara felt the weight of her journey in every note. Her voice rose and fell, carrying the melody like a wave crashing against the shore. She thought of her mother, her brothers, the subway platform where it had all begun. She thought of the people who had ignored her, and the few who had stopped to listen. All of it, the pain, the hope, the fight, was woven into the song. By the time she reached the final verse, her eyes were open, scanning the audience. She could see them now, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the stage lights. Some were wiping tears. Others sat frozen, captivated. Amara's voice softened as she sang the last line, her guitar fading into silence. The applause that erupted was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was thunderous, reverberating through the hall and crashing over her like a wave. People stood, cheering and clapping, their faces lit with admiration. Amara's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't the subdued clink of coins in a box. This was validation, pure and undeniable. She stepped back from the microphone, her hands trembling as she waved to the crowd. Vanessa was standing at the edge of the stage, clapping with a wide smile. For the first time in months, Amara let herself believe that she belonged here. Backstage, the energy was electric. Strangers congratulated her, their words a blur as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Vanessa pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." Amara blinked back tears. "I couldn't have done it without you." Vanessa pulled back, her smile warm. "You did this, Amara. Never forget that." As the night wound down, Amara found herself alone for a moment, leaning against a wall with her guitar resting at her side. The weight of the evening began to settle, and she allowed herself to reflect. This performance wasn't just a milestone. It was a promise to herself and to her family that she would keep pushing, keep fighting, and never lose sight of where she had come from. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her mother. "I watched the live stream. You were breathtaking. I'm so proud of you, my little star." Amara's lips trembled as she reread the message, her heart swelling. Her mother had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. This was for her brothers, for every moment they had struggled together. In the days that followed, offers began pouring in. Producers wanted to work with her, agents were eager to represent her, and reporters clamored for interviews. It was overwhelming, but Vanessa stayed by her side, guiding her through the chaos. Amara didn't say yes to everything. She was careful, thoughtful about each step she took. Her family still came first, and she made time to be there for them, to ensure they never felt forgotten. Her mother's health improved slightly, thanks to better care funded by Amara's newfound success. Her brothers looked at her with awe, their big sister now a rising star. But Amara never let herself forget the girl who had sung in the subway for spare change. She visited the station one quiet afternoon, standing in the spot where it had all begun. The noise of the trains and the chatter of commuters was the same, but she felt different, stronger, surer. A man dropped a coin into a busker's case nearby, and Amara smiled. Sometimes, all it took was one person to listen, one person to believe. As she walked away, her heart was light. The journey ahead was long, but Amara knew she was ready. She had found her voice, and now, the world was finally listening. The climb beyond dreams. Amara's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The once silent phone now buzzed constantly with calls and messages from agents, collaborators, and journalists. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new questions about what kind of artist and person she wanted to be. The momentum of her career was thrilling but exhausting. She had signed with a reputable management team, recorded a single that was gaining traction on streaming platforms, and booked a series of performances across the city. Yet, amidst the whirlwind, Amara felt an ache for the simplicity of her earlier days, when music had been her only escape and not yet her responsibility. Her mother's health was stabilizing with better medical care, though she still spent much of her time resting. Amara's younger brothers were adjusting to the changes as well, though they missed her presence at home. Some evenings, she'd find them waiting up just to hear about her day or to ask if she'd met anyone famous. "You're like a superhero now," Jamal said one night, his eyes wide with admiration. "Does that mean you can get us pizza every night?" Amara laughed, ruffling his hair. "I'm still your big sister, not a magician." But the guilt lingered. She wanted to be there more for them, to make sure they understood that her success wasn't about leaving them behind. It was for all of them. That tension followed her as she navigated her new world, always reminding her of why she had started this journey. One evening, after a long day of recording, Amara sat in a meeting with her team. Vanessa was there, as always, her calm presence a steadying force amidst the flurry of industry talk. Amara's latest single had been a surprising hit, and her management team was eager to capitalize on the momentum. "We need to start planning your debut album," one of the producers said, his voice enthusiastic. The public loves your raw, emotional style. We should lean into that. Another person chimed in. Agreed. But we also need to think commercially. Something more upbeat, maybe a collaboration with a big-name artist. Amara listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. These were seasoned professionals, people who understood the business far better than she did. But as the conversation went on, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. I appreciate all the ideas, she said finally, her voice steady but firm. But this album needs to be my story. I fought too hard to get here to not make it personal. The room went silent for a moment, and Amara worried she had overstepped. Then Vanessa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. She's right. This is her debut, her introduction to the world. It has to come from her heart. The others murmured their agreement, and the conversation shifted toward how they could balance Amara's artistic vision with commercial appeal. As the meeting ended, Vanessa pulled Amara aside. That was bold, Vanessa said, her tone approving. But you were right to speak up. Never let them steer you away from who you are. Amara nodded, grateful for Vanessa's support, but a small part of her wondered if staying true to herself would always be this hard. The following weeks were a blur of writing sessions, studio time, and late nights spent agonizing over lyrics. Amara poured everything into her songs, her struggles, her triumphs, her love for her family. Each track was a piece of her soul, a snapshot of the life she had lived and the dreams she was still chasing. One night, while working on a particularly personal song, she found herself stuck. The words wouldn't come, and the melody felt off. Frustrated, she put down her guitar and stepped outside for air. The city was quiet for once, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Amara leaned against the railing of the small balcony outside the studio, her thoughts heavy. She thought about her mother, her brothers, and the subway platform where it had all begun. She thought about the pressure she now faced, the expectations of so many people who barely knew her. Feeling stuck, Vanessa's voice came from behind her. Amara turned to see her mentor leaning in the doorway, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. You could say that, Amara admitted, her shoulders slumping. I'm trying to write something real, but it's like I've forgotten how. Vanessa joined her on the balcony, handing her the tea. You haven't forgotten. You're just overthinking it. Amara sighed, cradling the cup in her hands. It feels like there's so much riding on this. What if it's not good enough? Vanessa's expression softened. Do you remember what I told you before your first performance? Amara nodded. You said it wasn't about being liked. It was about being heard. Exactly, Vanessa said. That hasn't changed. The only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. If you're honest in your music, the rest will follow. The words struck a chord in Amara, and she nodded, her resolve strengthening. She returned to the studio that night with renewed focus, and the song that emerged was one of the most heartfelt she had ever written, a tribute to her mother and the sacrifices she had made for their family. Months later, Amara's debut album, Underground to Sky, was released. The cover featured a simple image of her holding her guitar, standing on a subway platform with the city skyline in the background. It was a nod to her roots, a reminder of where she had come from. The response was overwhelming. Critics praised her authenticity and emotional depth, calling her a fresh voice in an industry often dominated by manufactured stars. Fans connected with her story, flooding her social media with messages about how her music had moved them. The album climbed the charts, and Amara found herself thrust into a spotlight she wasn't sure she was ready for. But through it all, she stayed grounded. She continued to visit her family regularly, spending quiet evenings with her brothers and helping her mother with her recovery. She never stopped reminding herself of the girl who had sung for spare change, the girl who had dared to hope for something more. One night, as Amara prepared to take the stage at a sold-out concert, she stood in the wings, listening to the hum of the crowd. Her nerves were still there, but they no longer controlled her. Vanessa appeared beside her, a proud smile on her face. You've come a long way, Vanessa said, "But this is just the beginning." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Vanessa shook her head. "Don't thank me. This was all you." As Amara stepped onto the stage, the roar of the crowd washed over her like a wave. She stood at the microphone, her guitar slung over her shoulder, and took a deep breath. This was her moment, not just to sing, but to share her truth with the world. She strummed the first chord, and the room fell silent. Her voice rose, clear and strong, filling the space with the story of her journey. And for the first time, Amara didn't feel like she was chasing a dream. She was living it. The weight of stardom. Months turned into a year, and Amara's life continued to ascend beyond what she had once dared to imagine. Her debut album, Underground to Sky, had not only climbed the charts but cemented her as a new voice of authenticity in an industry often accused of superficiality. Yet with success came pressures she hadn't fully anticipated. Amara found herself on the road constantly, playing packed venues and navigating the relentless cycle of interviews, photo shoots, and appearances. She loved performing, standing under the lights, feeling the energy of the crowd, pouring her soul into each note. But the moments between the performances began to feel heavier. The music industry wasn't just about art. It was a machine. There were expectations to keep her image polished, to deliver new content faster, to meet standards that often felt out of sync with who she was. The meetings with executives became more frequent, their voices filled with suggestions that chipped away at her sense of self. "Your next album needs to evolve," one producer said during a particularly draining meeting. "Something more commercial. The public loves your raw emotion, but we need hits." Amara nodded, masking her frustration. She understood the business side of things, but the idea of compromising her music for algorithms and charts felt like a betrayal of the journey that had brought her here. On a rare day off, Amara returned home to visit her family. Her mother's health had stabilized thanks to the care they could now afford, but she was still frail. Her brothers had grown taller, their energy undiminished as they shared stories from school. Sitting around their tiny kitchen table, eating a simple meal of rice and beans, Amara felt a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in months. "Do you miss it?" Jamal asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. "The subway." Amara laughed, the sound filled with nostalgia. "Sometimes," she admitted. "It was simpler. Just me and my guitar." Her mother, seated across from her, gave her a knowing look. "Life's never simple, Amara. It's just a different kind of hard." Those words stayed with her as she returned to her tour. Her days became a blur of rehearsals, interviews, and performances. She was grateful for every moment, but she couldn't ignore the growing fatigue that weighed on her shoulders. Even Vanessa noticed. "You're burning out," Vanessa said one evening as they sat backstage after a show. Amara sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know how to slow down. Every time I think about taking a break, I feel like I'm letting people down." Vanessa reached out, placing a hand on Amara's. "You're no good to anyone, not your fans, not your family, and especially not yourself, if you don't take care of you. Trust me, I've been there." Amara nodded, but the thought of slowing down felt impossible. The world didn't stop moving, and she was afraid that if she paused, everything she had worked for might slip away. The breaking point came during a performance in Los Angeles. The venue was massive, the crowd electrified, but Amara felt disconnected as she took the stage. She pushed through her set, hitting every note, smiling at the right moments, and engaging with the audience. But by the end of the night, she felt hollow. Backstage, as the cheers of the crowd faded, she collapsed onto a couch, her head in her hands. Her manager approached cautiously, a concerned expression on his face. "Amara, are you okay?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to hold back the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." The admission felt like a crack in the dam she had been holding back for months. Vanessa arrived moments later, taking one look at Amara before wrapping her in a hug. "Enough," Vanessa said firmly. "You need to stop. Right now." Amara looked up at her, the words hitting her like a lifeline. "What if stopping ruins everything?" Vanessa's expression softened. "Stopping doesn't mean giving up. It means protecting yourself so you can keep going." With Vanessa's support, Amara announced a hiatus. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Fans expressed concern and understanding, while industry insiders questioned whether she was squandering her momentum. But for the first time in months, Amara felt a sense of relief. She returned home, grounding herself in the familiar rhythms of family life. She spent quiet mornings helping her mother with household tasks, afternoons playing basketball with her brothers, and evenings strumming her guitar without the pressure of creating something for an audience. Slowly, she began to rediscover her love for music, not as a career, but as a source of joy. During this time, she started journaling, writing down the thoughts and emotions that had been swirling in her mind. The entries soon evolved into lyrics, and before she knew it, she was composing songs again. These songs were different, less polished, more introspective. They spoke of exhaustion, renewal, and the struggle to balance ambition with authenticity. A year after her hiatus began, Amara returned to the studio to record her second album. This time, she had more control over the process. Vanessa stood by her side as a mentor and advocate, ensuring that Amara's vision remained at the forefront. The album, titled Roots and Wings, was a deeply personal exploration of her journey. It celebrated her growth while honoring her beginnings. The lead single, Home Is Where I Stand, became an anthem for resilience, resonating with fans who saw their own struggles reflected in her music. When the album was released, it debuted at the top of the charts, solidifying Amara's place as not just an artist, but a storyteller. Critics praised her ability to evolve while staying true to herself, and fans embraced her vulnerability with open arms. The night of her album launch concert, Amara stood backstage, looking out at the packed venue. This time, she wasn't nervous. She felt grounded, her feet firmly planted on the stage she had earned. Vanessa appeared beside her, a proud smile on her face. "You've come full circle," she said. "How does it feel?" Amara smiled, her heart full. "It feels like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." As the lights dimmed and the crowd erupted in cheers, Amara stepped onto the stage, her guitar slung over her shoulder. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she greeted the audience. "This next song," she began, "is for anyone who's ever felt like they couldn't keep going. It's for the fighters, the dreamers, and the ones who refuse to give up." The first chords echoed through the venue, and as Amara's voice filled the space, she felt the weight of her journey. She had faced the highs and the lows, the doubts and the triumphs, and she had emerged stronger. This wasn't the end of her story. Far from it. But in that moment, she knew she had found her balance. Amara was no longer just a girl singing for spare change in the subway. She was an artist, a daughter, a sister, and a voice for those who needed one. And as she looked out at the sea of faces illuminated by the stage lights, she felt the truth of it deep in her soul. She had roots, she had wings, and she was ready to soar.